All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jackie Baker. I'm the Program and Policy Manager here at E2 Tech. And I just have a couple announcements before we get going with our presenters. First off, this program will be recorded and all participants are muted, so please put your questions in the chat. If you wish to remain anonymous, please turn off your camera and change their name that appears on your Zoom account. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor for this event. Stantec has been a longtime supporter of E2 Tech, so thank you for sponsoring this event and making it possible. Now, E2 Tech is Maine's largest community of environmental and energy professionals. We have over 300 member companies, which are comprised of over 4,000 individuals in the business, government, education, and nonprofit worlds. And we have over 50 partner organizations. As an organization, we're a convener, a catalyst for growth, a credible resource, and a connector for the community. We also have 20 volunteer working board members who help oversee and run our organization. You can see all of their names and affiliations here. They're always happy to talk about E2 Tech with you. And as a nonprofit, our financial information is available. As you can see here, 20% of our revenue is from forums like this one. So we thank you all for registering today. And 50% of our revenues is from our membership dues. So thank you to our members who are on the call. That is really a huge piece of what keeps us going here. Lastly, I also want to acknowledge our co-chairs of our program committee, Vanessa Berry and Dale Knapp, for stepping into that leadership role recently and supporting programs like this. We have a whole host of programs coming up. The Clean Tech Open is tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. in Portland. And you can go to our website to see all the other programs we have, forums, webinars, networking opportunities in the works. There's always more coming down the pipeline, so keep an eye open for that. And we'd like to, again, thank all of our members. If anyone is not a member on the call and is interested in joining, I'm always open for questions, as well as our executive director, Eric Howard, who was not able to join us today. And at this point, I am going to pass the mic on to Brooke Barnes, who is one of our supporters.
Well, thanks very much, Jackie, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today for E2 Tech's Tech Talk. The Tech Talks are a platform for a quick look at innovations in environmental or energy policy and technology. Our discussion today revolves around the Aroostook Renewable Gateway, a legislatively driven desire to boost northern Maine by unlocking its renewable energy potential, linking it to the New England grid, and generating substantial economic benefit in the process. With us today are Bob Grace. Bob is President and Managing Director of Sustainable Energy Advantage, SEA, located in Framingham, Mass. Bob is a leader and innovator in market, policy, financial, and strategic analyses for renewable energy. In this role, since founding SEA 25 years ago, he's advised over 150 government, market participant, and nonprofit clients, exclusively focusing on renewable energy. Prior to founding SEA, Bob served as principal analyst to the team's pioneering electric industry restructuring at New England Power Company. He developed a national green power business plan for NEP and was appointed director of the Green Power Division of All Energy Marketing Company, which launched the first renewable energy-based retail offering in the Eastern U.S. Bob holds an MS in Energy and Resources from the University of California at Berkeley and a BS in Energy Studies from Brown University. Joining Bob is Po-Yu Yuan, a senior consultant and market analytics manager at SEA. With SEA since 2013, her areas of focus include rec market analysis and strategic support, clean energy supply, procurement and bidding, renewable energy policy analysis, policy cost modeling, including ratepayer analysis and cost-benefit analysis, and also grid-scale renewable energy development cost and deployment forecasting. Po-Yu led SEA's, which you're going to hear more about shortly, New York Renewable Energy Market Outlook, REMO, fundamentals analysis for the New York Clean Energy Standard Market, and is a key contributor to SEA's New England REMO analysis for our region's RPS, Regional Portfolio Standard, Class 1 markets. Po Yu holds an MS in Urban and Regional Policy from Northeastern University, focusing on clean energy policy and sustainable community development, and a BS in Environmental Science from Wentworth Institute in Boston. A disclaimer before we get going. The materials presented in this webinar reflect SEA's own research, analysis, and interpretation of market activities. SEA is engaged by the Maine Governor's Energy Office and the Maine Public Utilities Commission as a consultant on projects other than this one. They are not engaged on this one. The views and opinions expressed in this webinar belong to SEA and do not reflect the opinions or positions of E2Tech or any other entities. We'll wrap up at 1 today. As we roll along, please put your questions or comments in the chat box and we'll respond as time allows. We had a disturbing occurrence of Zoom bombing on a recent forum. We've taken steps to prevent that from happening again, but if it does occur, this Tech Talk will end and it will not resume, just to set you up for that. So all that out of the way, let's talk about the Aroostook Renewable Gateway. Bob and Po Yu will briefly provide context for where we are in the process of making the legislative vision a reality, and based on their New York experience, offer an innovative concept for discussion. Take it away, Bob.
Great. First of all, can everybody hear me?
You're good.
Okay, and I'm now trying to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation. That good?
Yes.
Great. Welcome. So again, I'm Bob Grace. Welcome to our chat about reflections on the Northern Maine transmission line redo. You've already heard our disclaimer from Brooke. Thank you for that. With those extensive bios, I don't need to spend very much time talking about us. Key point here is that we're market analysts. We work for a very broad range of public and private sector stakeholders, trying to help figure out and understand pathways to clean energy deployment through a number of consulting services and subscription-based services that are summarized here. Today, my colleague Po Yu and I are going to be talking about a path to Northern Maine renewables and some lessons that might help influence or create some thoughts on how to deploy more optimally going forward from recent actions in New York and from our own analysis that we've been doing over the last year or two, kind of looking at what we expected or hoped or thought could happen with the Northern Maine generation and transmission deployment. And then we'll wrap up talking about some of the barriers and the opportunities for a redo of the Northern Maine transmission and generation procurement, which is where the commission is heading. So first of all, to set the stage here, Maine and New England have very aggressive renewable energy and greenhouse gas goals. To meet the quantities needed, and we know this because we spend all our time analyzing these challenges, you can't get from here to there without contributions from a lot of different sources: offshore wind, imports of clean energy, distributed renewables, and large-scale renewables that are land-based. The numbers just don't add up if you knock any of those options out. When it comes to land-based large-scale renewables, Maine is where the megawatts are, and Northern Maine is where the biggest megawatts are. And economies of scale is a big issue in terms of the cost to ratepayers of feasibly deploying large quantities of renewables. Build big enough, and you can be way more cost-effective than deploying rooftop by rooftop solar. The legislature recognized this in triggering Maine into the procurement that we'll be talking about. But let's take a look at the why here. Why are we even talking about a path to Northern Maine renewables? First of all, Northern Maine is the best place to develop large-scale energy resources in the whole region. When you look at the interconnection queue request, which is one indicator of this, where are people developing? You can look at, on the left, how much is being developed in Aroostook County versus the rest of Maine versus all the rest of New England or the New England region. And so this is a good quick indicator to tell you where do the folks looking to make investments in bringing supply to meet the demands that we've put out there as legislators, policymakers. Where's it going to come from? We know that northern Maine is not transmission connected to where the load is. And so a transmission line connecting northern Maine can unlock that northern Maine renewable energy resource potential and the benefits that go with it, the decarbonization, energy equity, economic benefits to the state, winter reliability from resources that produce at times other than where most of the other development in Maine is going in solar right now, and provide energy security. So in the deployment of, or the attempts to deploy resources to tap the northern Maine opportunity in 2001, the PUC issued an RFP. How did that come about? Well, in the 2021 session, the legislature created a law that would require RFPs for renewable energy generation and a transmission line to connect it. And in November of 2021, the PUC issued a single document, which effectively was two embedded RFPs, looking for RFP requests for proposals, looking for proposals to fulfill this need. The transmission bids were due first, and those bids were then, information about those bids was then made available to the generators, who could customize their generation proposals to interconnect with the transmission proposals that would best sync up with their particular generation plans. Several months later, the generation bids were due, with an inclusion of an indication of which transmission project they would want to intend to connect to. In November, after spending a lot of time analyzing all the proposals that came in, the PUC chose and provided conditional approval to enter into term sheets with two projects: a transmission project, LS Power's Aroostook Renewable Gateway, a 1,200 megawatt project intended to interconnect in 2029, and the King Pine Wind Project to be developed by Long Road Energy at 1,000 megawatts of capacity, which would be planned to enter construction in 2028. Obviously wouldn't deliver power until the transmission system was up. And this conditional approval, a couple of interesting and important things about them. First of all, the approval was for an energy-only contract with King Pine. So it would be responsible for, but not have hedges on, its renewable energy credit and capacity revenue streams. And it was conditional because the ultimate approval depended on some other things outside of the immediate control of the commission. In June of 2023, the legislature adopted another law effectively requiring the commission to do another procurement to fill up the gap in the line. If there's a 1,200 megawatt line, 1,000 megawatt generation, how can we potentially use some of that unused space to potentially improve economics? The parallel activity that was going on, the reason that things were conditional, is because of what was going on in Massachusetts. In August of 2022, Massachusetts adopted legislation that allowed the Department of Energy Resources to study and consider whether to take on some of the obligation, 40% of the supply that the PUC in Maine had identified as winners. Why would this be considered? Well, 1,000 megawatts of wind and a 1,200 megawatt line is a lot for Maine. It's an expensive proposition, and there are regional needs and problems. And so it would be easier for the commission potentially to make a decision to go forward if others were potentially sharing the costs. And at the end of December of 2022, the Department of Energy Resources concluded that this would be in the interest of Massachusetts to step up and do a proportional share of the transmission and of the generation contract, but in Massachusetts decision, they would want to also capture the renewable energy credits, which could then be used towards the Massachusetts renewable portfolio standards. So in February, after that approval, Maine, the PUC approved both the TSA, Transmission Service Agreement, and the PPA, Power Purchase Agreement, the term sheets for those for 60% of the projects that have been proposed. From there, we entered a period of parallel negotiations in Maine and in Massachusetts with the related parties, the regulators, the utilities, and here's where some challenges came about, because this became a big job of herding cats, and these processes were never designed to and didn't sync up very well. By June, the final timelines that were in the TSA and PPA filings had lapsed, and by October, the PUC indicated we need to understand whether things are moving forward enough, ordered LS Power to file a modified or new proposed TSA. Give us something that you would move forward with. In November, LS Power filed that TSA. In December, the PUC terminated the procurement, and thus with it the Wind Project 2 with nothing to plug into. In January, LS Power filed with the commission a informative letter indicating some of the reasons why it couldn't hold to the original term sheet. And it was really important observations there that this process of bringing in Massachusetts after the bid introduced timing and cost and risks that were not envisioned in and could not really be accommodated in the original bid that they had put forward. And therefore they couldn't move forward without making changes that the commission, as we understand it, was unwilling to move forward with. So that's where we ended up with the commission having an order not to proceed and saying that they intended to reboot and do a procurement over again in the coming months or years. They have not identified a timetable yet. And potentially including some changes. Now, this is implied, but I think this is why we're talking now. It could include changes to help ensure its success. Anyway, there are no details on what it might look like and its timing, but that gives us something to work from here. So what are some of the challenges going forward if the state intends to do a redo? There are some big macroeconomic factors. So since this whole process started, we already were within the era of COVID, which was causing inflationary pressures and disruption of supply chain. And layered on top of that during this process was the start of the Ukraine war and the ripple effect that's basically led to inflation, higher interest rates, supply chain challenges, all having upward pressure on cost and therefore price. There were also some challenges associated with having separate transmission and generation requests for proposals. That structure in which different pieces would be proposed to the commission did not create the ability for generation bidders to coordinate and optimize transmission usage. And the commission isn't particularly well positioned to deal with the negotiations, the modeling, the analysis to try to figure out how to optimize that. And it really limited the ability and the flexibility of a self-selected transmission or generation partner to effectively line up or team up. There were reasons for that, and probably a lot of good reasons. It's not like it's a slam dunk to do it one way or another, but in doing it that way, it did introduce some challenges. And it introduced a lot of challenges and made for a very complicated evaluation and selection process, which is why we saw 6 months pass or longer before a conditional approval was made. It kind of goes with the territory with this degree of complexity. Massachusetts' participation introduced both upside benefits. Massachusetts could potentially help defray the cost or spread the cost over a much broader group of ratepayers, as well as by contracting for renewable energy credits, provide a better hedge and help financing of the projects. But that added negotiation and approval process that was distinct from Maine's really introduced significant delays, a lot of uncertainties. There wasn't a very clear process on how those discussions could or would move forward, or much of a timetable to make sure that they did, and that imposed risks on the developers and the investors. There are also some market rules constraints at play here that we'll talk a little bit about, and that limit some of what the meat of what we're going to talk about today can do. In New England, in ISO New England, there are challenges to the business model of how a network transmission resource could actually move forward with a fixed or capped price, which was a requirement of the RFP. It's very challenging, and there isn't a lot of precedent to how to make that work within the ISO New England tariff. I'm sure LS Power and the other bidders went through a great deal of time and expense to try to craft something that was responsive. But in addition, ISO New England has what's called a loss of load or a loss of source limit of 1,200 megawatts for interconnected resources. And so that basically means you can't be bigger than the biggest contingency on the system, or else you'll make the system less reliable. And the way the current rules work, that calculation, the 1,200 megawatts, is the sum of all the resources that are behind a transmission line. It wouldn't be the 1,200 megawatts of the transmission line, which potentially limits the ability to do some of the things we're about to talk about. This is a rule that ISO New England is looking at potentially changing. We'll talk more about that later. Finally, project maturity and permitting challenges. So the Aroostook Gateway project had not landed all of its land rights, or was not very far along in permitting or engineering. It was a fairly immature project, and that creates its own set of challenges. And as everybody here knows, unless you've been hiding under a rock, the project has been facing some permitting and public acceptance challenges, which is the nature of any big infrastructure project, both at the local and state legislature levels. So that continues to be a challenge. That's really outside the scope of what we're going to focus on today, but it would be illusory for me to ignore that. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Yu, and she's going to take us through some analogs and analysis that will hopefully be helpful in thinking about where we could go, where the region could go, where the state could go in having a better outcome. So, Yu.
Great, thank you very much. And can you all see my screen? I assume so.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with a new Northern Maine transmission and generation procurement ahead of us, we have identified some lessons and examples from our New York and New England renewable energy market analysis that could potentially provide some ideas of what a new Northern Maine transmission and generation project and procurement could look like. Starting with New York, which also has identified its own transmission need to unlock upstate clean energy resources and deliver them downstate to New York City in order to decarbonize the region and meet its own statewide renewable energy goal. In recognition of that, the state has adopted a new Tier 4 under its clean energy standard, New York's version of RPS, and issued a procurement in 2021 for 1,500 megawatt of new clean energy resources that are either located in New York City or delivered from other locations and to Zone J or New York City via a new transmission line. A couple of things to note that while the New York Tier 4 procurement have similarities to the Northern Maine RFP, there are also some key differences. One is that the New York Tier 4 procurement is a REC-only contract for differences procurement. So instead of having separate TSAs for transmission and PPAs for the generation that may be energy or REC only, this is a REC-only contract, and the REC payments would cover both the renewable energy premiums as well as the cost of transmission through it. Another difference is that the Tier 4 procurement allows for projects to bid as a package of transmission and generation, essentially allowing transmission and generation developers to self-select their partners. And the package can include multiple projects from multiple generation developers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And so this provides the opportunity for the developers themselves to identify and optimize the package. In our 2020 analysis, ahead of the solicitations, before the RFP came out, but after the Tier 4 policy was announced, SCA has done some analysis looking at what are the potential transmission projects that may bid into the upcoming RFP and what are the potential dancing partners in terms of the generation developers based on public information known. And so here are some examples, and just highlighting that the Empire State Connector is essentially now the Clean Path New York, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And a couple of key observations we have at the time from our pre-RFP assessment on the potential competitive landscape. So the Champlain-Hudson Power Express line, a transmission line which connects between Quebec to New York State, was expected to have the highest fixed cost due to its distance and design features. However, at the time, we expected this project would be able to spread costs over more contracted Tier 4 RECs and energy delivery, and because it was targeting a very high capacity factors over the line by leveraging hydro from Quebec. In contrast, a in-state transmission line with in-state resources, let's say only wind resource, will have a much lower capacity factor and line usage. Here is an example of the hourly delivery over a theoretical in-state transmission line in New York that is only delivering wind resources from multiple locations. For 1,000 megawatt of wind, and assuming that all wind resources have a 35% capacity factor, and that this is showing the hourly delivery over the line from upstate to New York City throughout the year. And as you can see, there's a lot of space that's unfilled during a lot of the hours, and at over the year, the line usage is essentially at a 35% capacity factor, leaving a lot of room for additional delivery. However, we at the time hypothesized that a potential model is for projects to overload the line with more resources, potentially stacking more resources above, with generation capacity above the transmission capacity, as well as stacking resources that don't have the same generation profile, such as resources that are in different locations, as well as of different technologies, and further stacking the resources and filling the space. Here's an example that shows the same 1,000 megawatt line, but now with significantly more resources. Instead of 1,000 megawatt wind, we have 800 megawatt of wind and 800 megawatt of solar from different locations that are stacked on top of each other. And this is showing that much more of the space is filled. The line capacity factor is at 45%. It's important to note that in this model, some of the hours, the generation may not be able to deliver to New York City in hours where the total generation capacity exceeds the transmission capacity. However, storage would be able to help reshape some of these stranded generation and allow them to be delivered across the line in later hours. At the added cost due to the storage. And at the time, our analysis suggests that for this specific example, by adding a 200 megawatt 4-hour storage, it could significantly reduce the undeliverable generation by 75 to 80%. And the added benefit of storage would be to better align the generation and load profiles in the state and further meet some of the state's energy need, as well as for the project, making it more attractive and competitive in this non-price evaluation. One thing to note is that while stacking non-coincident resources, in addition to technology, geographic diversity could also play a factor in order to identify to create a package of resources that don't have coincident generation.
So Poyu, that was our hypothesis. What actually happened when it came time for bids?
Yeah, good that you ask. So here are the actual projects that bid into the Tier 4 procurement. And so here are, so there were 6 projects in total with alternative bid options within each project. And as you can see, a couple of very interesting things is that for all the projects that have provided some of the public information, all have provided and proposed options to include a portfolio of generation supply mix that include multiple non-coincident resources like wind and solar, plus hydro, as well as and so a lot of the 2 out of the 6 projects have also included proposed storage, while it is not clear or explicitly provided and discussed in some of the public bid informations. Based on our review of the proposals and our research, it is our understanding that most of the proposals have included a portfolio of resources from different geographic diversity, as well as overstacking the line with more generation capacity than transmission capacity. Ultimately, the state has selected 2 winners, the 1250 megawatt Champlain Hudson line for the hydro-only bid options, as well as the 1300 megawatt Clean Path New York line, which includes a combination of upstate generation clean renewable energy resources as well as pumped hydro, which I will talk about in a second. And then one last thing to note is that for some of these proposals, in addition to what I've presented here, there are also additional features such as bilateral lines that provide additional system benefits that were considered for the evaluation.
So Poyu, the Clean Path New York line has probably the best analogy to the situation in northern Maine. Could you drill down into that one?
Yes. So here, a couple of facts about the Clean Path New York line. It's a 1300 megawatt HVDC line that included a generation portfolio of 23 solar and wind projects across 5 NISO zones from 6 developers in New York. The total capacity of generation is 3,800 megawatts, so more than double the transmission capacity of the line. And there's also ability for the project to add additional supply over time as well before its commercial operation. In addition, the project included a 1160 megawatt pumped hydro that's owned by NYPA on the input side. And so here we're showing essentially the same image that we've shown before for the 8760 hourly delivery across the line, as well as what is undelivered above in hours where generation exceeds transmission. A couple of things to note: because of how much the project have overstacked the line, it has a very high line capacity factor of 65%, although that also comes with 24% many hours where generation exceeds the transmission cap. About 24% of hours over the year would include generation that exceeds the transmission cap, because of the ability of storage being able to reshape some of the generation. Ultimately, the undelivered energy to New York City is about 9% of the energy production each year. And so, as you can see, this is an example where by overstacking a lot of different resources that have different generation profiles across different locations and technologies, one can really maximize or boost the capacity factors across the line. Just a couple of things to note that is unique to the Tier 4 structure and maybe this project that may not be able to apply to the Northern Maine situation. One is that because of the Tier 4 structure enables a lot more geographic diversity, where it's collecting resources from all over upstate New York that would allow for more stacking of non-coincident generation. Secondly, in New York, under the Tier 4 structure and under the clean energy standard structure, all the generation that's undelivered and can't get over the line to New York City during those hours where generation exceeds the transmission cap, those generation can still earn energy revenues in the home markets, as well as be able to be qualified for Tier 1 RECs and generate REC revenues that way. And so there is less risk associated with and ultimately costs associated with really overstacking the line.
So basically, there's a market outlet for what can't get over the line that really doesn't exist in the Maine construct.
Exactly. So what may that mean for the Northern Maine transmission and generation projects? We have actually done some analysis to reimagine a Northern Maine transmission and generation package that also involves overloading the line. So here is what that A760 hourly delivery picture look like for the previously awarded Northern Maine transmission Aroostook Gateway Line and the 1,000 megawatt King Pine Wind project. At a 36% capacity factor, you can see that there's a lot of space unused across the line for this project. The line capacity factor is effectively at 30% because the generation capacity is below the transmission capacity, leaving a lot of room to fill the space. And like Bob has said earlier, in 2023, the legislature has actually has passed a bill that would direct the PUC to do another round of procurement to fill the unused space of the line with new supply. But in addition to that, there's also space for overstacking non-coincident resources to further boost the capacity factor of the line.
So, Poyu, the key point here to really boil this down to something simple is whatever energy is coming across the line has to carry the whole cost of the line. And so what are some of the alternatives to that?
Right. So in our most recent Renewable Energy Market Outlook remote analysis that was done in December 2023, we have actually evaluated a couple of different scenarios of line loading across the Northern Maine transmission line and to understand what this Class 1 REC deliveries would look like and its impact to the Class 1 REC markets in New England. Here is a low line loading scenario where we simply fill the unused transmission capacity with additional wind projects that are of similar generation profile, similar capacity factor, that allows you to boost that line capacity factor from 30% to 36%, and improving the economics a little bit. However, like we said earlier, if you then further stack some non-coincident solar resources on top of the wind, you could further boost the capacity factor. So here is an example where we added additional 400 megawatt of solar on top of the 1,200 megawatt of wind supply, and that boost the capacity factor to 41% over the line, although that comes with some hours of curtailment, which is about 0.6% of expected annual energy production each year. Lastly, you can even further boost the line, especially if you leverage better energy storage systems. Here's a high line loading scenario where we add additional wind, up to 1,600 megawatt of wind, again, similar generation profile, similar capacity factors, and still 400 megawatt of solar. And now you can boost the line capacity factor to 50%, and resulted in about 6% of expected annual energy production curtailment each year. But you can start really boosting the capacity factor across the line. And what does that actually translate into dollar amount? That would require much more detailed analysis, but here, just as a quick example, to illustrate what the potential impact would be and what is the potential cost saving would be by improving or boosting the capacity factor across a transmission line. What does that mean to the total cost of a project on a dollar per megawatt hour basis? Like Bob said, ultimately it is about dividing the fixed cost over more generation. So at a 30% capacity factor, the total cost may be at $105. And with each increment of capacity factor across line, the cost of transmission would go down as the fixed cost is now divided over more generation that can be delivered across the line. And so the total cost would go down. This should be $102. And as you can see, between 30% to 85%, that is a drastic difference of over $20 per megawatt hour of difference in cost. And we've similarly shown a higher cost example. What if transmission cost is higher? And the conclusion is the same, but this provides kind of a bound of what illustrative examples of what this may look like.
And the more expensive the transmission is, the bigger the savings from being able to use it more efficiently. Pretty logical outcome.
All right. So taking some of these lessons learned, what does it actually, where may the North Maine procurement go? So I'm going to turn back to Bob to talk about some of the potential barriers, potential opportunities that may be coming.
Great. And let me just make sure you all can see my screen again.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you, Po Yu, for setting it up. So given this set of examples, let's take a look at some of the considerations. There are barriers. So as I foreshadowed earlier, ISO New England currently has a loss of source limit of 1,200 megawatts, and the way that's applied is it's applied to not to the 1,200 megawatts of an interconnecting facility, transmission facility, but it would be applied to the sum of the capacity of the generation resources that were feeding into it, even if they were completely non-coincident, even if you had one generation technology that was producing 1,200 megawatts a night and another was producing 1,200 megawatts during the day. ISO New England's rules would treat those as 2,400 megawatts, violates the limit, can't do it. ISO is considering potentially changing this. It's on the agenda of things being discussed at the November Board of Directors presentation. It was identified to re-examine the limits and how this might be applied as part of 2024. So that would be an important threshold or barrier to overcome to be able to pursue this loading the line strategy. Independent from that, though, is re-envisioning potentially how a transmission and generation solicitation might be launched. As I mentioned earlier, there are pros and cons from doing it the way that the commission chose to, in terms of getting separate proposals and trying to piece together what would be optimal. And that came at the cost of the ability to potentially optimize use of the line. Having them separate hinders that optimization of generation portfolios and does add a degree of evaluation complexity that an alternative approach like that taken in New York could basically push out to the proposing teams to come with, we've figured out a package that works together, and now you just can compare one package versus another. And anecdotally, I believe that there were even some generation projects that were in more than one proposal. So it doesn't necessarily hinder creativity. There's always going to be siting, permitting, public acceptance challenges. Nothing we're talking about here can address those, and that's really outside the scope of the work that we're doing. So I'm not going to give that more of our time. The opportunities to boost the line through non-coincident production diversity exist. Wind is being developed in northern Maine, in Aroostook. Solar is being developed in Aroostook. There is a biomass industry in that area, and interest in biomass and combining heat and power. In fact, in the original legislation requiring the procurement, there was a requirement or a preference for any project that would include biomass in the mix. And storage was also an eligible technology. So storage, it would be easy to deploy there in terms of battery storage. Another option, which is still hasn't been broadly deployed and may or may not make sense economically, but to the degree that there was generation from overstacking the line that couldn't be used, in theory, it could be made. You could place electrolyzers in the region and use it to create green hydrogen. So both shaving the peak and capturing that resource for use otherwise. At a low capacity factor, the economics of that might look pretty bad, but there, as one does an engineering economic optimization exercise, it's certainly possible that could be part of the solution as well. Boosting the hedge effectiveness. So pretty much everybody else other than Maine, when they do large-scale renewables procurement, they buy the RECs too, leaving the REC revenue at unhedged and in the hands of the generator increases risk and increases their cost of financing. So another consideration might be the commission is allowed to consider RECs, but they had expressed a preference for projects with energy only. That's something that a position the commission has generally held over the last decade or so. But in a world in which the state of Maine is trying to get to deep decarbonization, the trade-offs, you might come out in a different place and give this type of a procurement a better chance of success or being more cost effective by considering that. And again, reimagining how to package a transmission and, sorry, that should be a T&G, not T&D, transmission and generation procurement. Another factor here is the role of other states. So as LS Power had called out, great to have Massachusetts interested, but please, if you're going to do it again, figure that out beforehand so we know what we're proposing to, and introducing in other states, other players, changing the structure after the bid makes it really hard on the respondents. So other states in New England are considering policies that could lead to a multi-state coordinated procurement. In Maine, pending a lot of details to be worked out and timing, but the Massachusetts House side of the Telecommunications Utility and Energy Committee has proposed a bill in this session to extend the timeline for this for a coordinated procurement of transmission and generation, basically allowing Massachusetts to continue to participate in a redo by Maine. Very recently, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, kind of the analog to the Maine Governor's Energy Office, issued a draft Section 35 study that recommended coordinated procurement of onshore wind in addition to offshore wind and large hydro, suggesting that there might be interest out of Connecticut. And so Massachusetts and Connecticut could bring a lot of load to the table. Even Vermont could potentially be of interest. Vermont is in the midst of a evolution to its renewable energy standard, in which there may be a creation of a regional tier for meeting their 100% renewables goals. And the largest utilities in Vermont have included, have needs in their integrated resource plan, suggesting a desire to have resources with a different production profile than the solar that's been most of what they've procured lately. And it's entirely possible that Vermont could join, maybe Rhode Island, New Hampshire, probably a longer shot. But the conditions for regional interest and potential cooperation exist. In addition, there's a potential model that has recently been crafted that might be applied here as well or modified. And that is, well, first of all, multi-state coordination is really challenging. A decade ago, was it that long? Maybe it was not quite that long ago. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut tried to do a 3-state procurement, and they executed one in which they basically all had a procurement together, selected resources, and the message received from lots of people involved in that was never again. The complexity of trying to line up everybody's different processes and timelines and approval processes at the different state levels meant every state was constrained by whatever the slowest link was. So there were bottlenecks all over the place. It was a tremendous challenge in herding cats. My colleague here, John Keene, worked for the state of Massachusetts in their end of it, and he has relayed many stories to me of how that's a model that will probably never be tried again. But there's a recent example of something a little different, and that is in the example of a multi-state or three-state memorandum, MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut on how to jointly seek scale economies in going after offshore wind. And so late last year, there was an MOU that was released while those three states were in the process of running or about to release their own offshore wind procurements. And this allowed for separate RFPs, but with coordination and the ability for bidders to offer multi-state bids and for states to consider multi-state bids. And if any combination of states agreed to select a multi-state bid, that they would basically split the energy and attributes. And so there's a pathway here and a model. And maybe taking some of these examples and doing them before the PUC comes out with their next procurement, we could create opportunities to increase the chance of successful deployment. So that's where I'm going to stop. And we've got some time for Q&A.
I was just reaching for the hook, Bob, so that was perfect.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to handle any hopefully this stimulates some good conversation.
I'll moderate some of the questions that we've received. One of the first ones was, what's the response been by the Maine PUC, the Maine Governor's Energy Office, and ISO New England to this concept of stacking? And I'll warn you, they're all on this call.
Well, excellent question. And I don't think it's really been talked about much. We, in our subscription-based service, where a lot of those entities are listeners, are participants, they've heard us talking about it. But it's not something that's been tested significantly. So I think one of the reasons why I accepted the invitation for us to share those thoughts and look at the experience of elsewhere is to help stimulate that conversation. There are pros and cons and trade-offs all over the place here, but to explore whether there are any elements of this which could advance things. You could use the line more effectively even without ISO changing things, but if ISO changes things, it gives you much more latitude and space to work within. Yeah, I might stop there.
Good. Yeah, I'm gonna push you to keep it crisp so we can get through these. And so, in both the pros and the cons perspective, did you identify any additional cost savings to the grid due to the higher efficiency of the line across the ISO network?
So the devil's in the details there. While we didn't do a deep economic analysis of that question, I think if you had a less intermittent flow over the line, it would put less pressure on the other resources in the grid to be able to integrate a dramatically swinging production profile that might come from having, say, just one wind project.
And this maybe is on the con side, is doesn't oversubscription create more risk for the generators and their financial backers, which would in turn drive up their costs, which in the table you had the high stacking at still the same $75 per megawatt. But wouldn't it actually drive up the costs when there's uncertainty and a risk premium associated with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the possibility that the generation component could be a little bit more expensive is definitely there. But if you're talking about fractions of a percent or a couple percent of curtailment, what that means to the cost is basically it's going to go up by about that percentage. The benefit is that if you could double the capacity factor of the line, the cost of the line is going to drop by half. And so there are numbers at which this works. Further, if you are non-coincident and you allow a consortium of transmission and generation participants to effectively negotiate how they're going to let, the rules of engagement, I guess is a way to talk about it. Who would get curtailed under what circumstances. At least that can be known. These are things that are analyzable and boundable. It doesn't mean that all bets are off and now you just don't know what will happen. You can design a portfolio or a bid in which the trade-offs would be worth it.
Po Yu, I think you spoke about how geographic diversity matters. And Bob, is it Northern Maine ISA? The NMISA is a large area. Can you guys say anything more about how projects in different locations can cost effectively connect?
Yeah.
Or how does that increase the cost efficiency?
Maybe I'll maybe start with that, and Po Yu can chime in here. In New York, for example, there are very different regimes of just like you have snow effect off of the lakes. For wind, you would have very different wind profiles in Buffalo or along the shores of the lakes versus on mountain ridges. They just have very different weather patterns and characteristics, and therefore, if you're tying those together, they may be non-coincident. Solar is going to be more coincident, but if you have clouds in some places and not clouds in other places, you can get some coincidence benefits. The coincidence benefits are greatest when you are spread over a very broad area with different weather drivers. So you could have some coincidence in an area the size of Aroostook, but you're not going to have as much as you would in an area the size of upstate New York, which has more geographic feature diversity that drives different weather patterns.
Yeah, and Bob, can you confirm and maybe apply that to the New England example, that in the New York model, projects are not necessarily physically interconnected to a transmission line, but done through scheduling?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure where you're heading.
Or as in that that projects are allowed to also kind of they're essentially selling energy and then buying energy at different connected points to connect to the line. So if there are projects over different NYSER zones that are connected to the same like Clean Path New York project, it's not necessarily done physically connected.
Right. So I think that is a challenge also. So if basically the Northern Maine transmission facility is one giant lead line and the resources aren't otherwise connected to the grid, if you can't deliver them, then you're going to have to curtail them or capture energy in storage or electrolysis on that side of the line, not a constraint in the same way in the New York example.
And I'll just note Melissa Winnie from ISO New England dropped some links into the chat box regarding the loss of source limit discussions, if anyone's interested in exploring
Excellent.
those some more.
Thank you so much.
And we're going to wrap up. I'm a big start on time, end on time kind of a guy. I want to thank Po Yu and Bob and all of you for attending. If you want to keep the discussion going, right there on the screen are Bob and Po Yu's contact information. So I urge you to reach out to them. If any of you have a new energy / environment technology or idea, drop Jackie or I a note, and we'll get it into the mix for one of these tech talks that E2 Tech likes to do. Also, visit our website, as Jackie said at the top of the hour, for upcoming events and more information on the Clean Tech Accelerator, which is tomorrow evening at the Maine Center on 4th Street in Portland. I want to thank everyone again, and thank Bob and thank Po Yu. And I hope you all have a wet and windy day. Be safe out there. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.